He's a psychopath.
Our favourite psychopath.
Not a psychopath, Anderson. I'm a high-functioning sociopath. Do your research.
It's an experiment.
Look at you lot.
Shut up, everybody! Shut up! Don't move, don't speak, don't breathe!
I am on fire! Is it nice not being me? It must be so relaxing. No, don't be like that.
Bored!
No.
Bored!
You could be trying to tell us
Yes,
something.
thank you for your input.
Hey, welcome. I want to talk about the 80s. And this is all just my opinion, so just relax. It's all right. I'm just talking about things I like. Then it ended up being 25 things. And so I'll do it in the countdown style since people like countdowns so much. I remember in like second grade watching, those actual film movies with the reel-to-reel, and then they started off with a countdown. And it's all like gummed up and dirty, like the vintage style, I counted down with the class. It was always fun. And then we never say anything at the end. And so I said, blast off. And the whole class laughed and I loved it. And it was one of my early tastes of, having a large group of people, respond and laugh and like what I was saying. Like it is on YouTube, although I can't see you and hear you, which kind of sucks sometimes. But I know you're there and I see the reactions. And little did I know I'd have basically I would have thought of as like a TV show that was actually really big, and that it would be about the last video I made was about countdowns and blast off, although I was critical of it, but I think even then I understood the psychology of it and that people love the countdowns, so, and I did too. I understand it. So let's do this. Let's start at number 25, things about the 80s that you may not know, a lot of you. You may know it, but you may not have thought about it in a long time, and you may miss it. So number 25 is notes. So notes were actual notes of, something you wrote on paper and you passed them around, and it was really cool. And it was oftentimes, used as evidence, for somebody's, thinking something or whatever, saying something. And it's how shy people communicated, and I think a lot of us are that way with our comments here on YouTube. But it's kind of cool how we can do it now, but I do kind of miss the personal touch of the notes and the special ways that people would fold it. And I got notes from girls and it was folded up super neat. And, we did like small time origami just with all that stuff. We got good at stuff like shuffling a deck of cards and stuff like that. I doubt most kids could do today. Like almost all the kids knew how to do that. In number 24, you'd go to the movies. There weren't as many theaters there. The main difference is the movies were packed. Like nowadays they're just empty. I mean, there are a lot more theaters and people just don't go as much though. It just in general, it doesn't almost everywhere I personally go. There's not really a lot of lines, it's like a lot of stuff is just kind of lonely or empty nowadays. Whereas back then, like you expected to see a lot of people. If there was a premiere, you'd show up early to get your tickets, or you'd drive out there and buy your tickets early and hang on to them. You can't forget them. And then go to the movies, wait in line. You see almost everybody. And then you see kids from other schools. And, it was just cool. It was exciting. Social. 23, there were lots of kids. Yep. And, you could visit them in their homes and they would visit you, sometimes in groups, and you never knew. Sometimes when there'd be a knock at the door or the phone would ring, they'd be wanting to come over, or, you could ask and go there. Sometimes you almost made new friends, just going to one person's house and then somebody else shows up and you get to know them. And it was just cool, social. And the moms were there. Most people, the mother was at home, and it was nice because you felt safer. If there's like an older brother that shows up who's angry and mean or something, at least, there was a limit to what he was going to do, because the mom was there. And she also made you feel comfortable, and she'd make you, at least some of my friends, moms made like cookies, different things that were really good. And like nowadays, like People don't bake as much, I think. And usually it'll just be like, if they give you snacks, it's from the same store you shop at, so it's not like new. But when they were baking more, it was new. And sometimes it wasn't good, but usually it was good. And some of my favorite things that I like nowadays, I learned about because of, somebody's mom happened to make it, 22, prank calls.
Hello?
Pat, it's Hev.
Now, if you lived in that time, you got prank calls from time to time, which was, depending on who you are, either funny or just kind of cool or, hilarious, or maybe you laugh about it later if you're annoyed at the time. It seems like when it's portrayed, like the people getting the prank calls really hate it. And I think and I did prank calls, probably most kids did do prank calls. And they were fun and funny. And sometime I'll just have to do a video on some of the prank calls that I did back then with my friends that were just hilarious. But the person on the other end sounded angry. But I don't think they actually were, looking back on it. But, they'd tell you, I'm going to trace this number and find out who you are. And I'm going to call the police, and you hang up. You're like, yeah, right. And you hang up and then you're just like terrified. So number 21, siblings. Like, I don't know the statistics on it. If I saw the stats on it, I don't know that I would necessarily believe it anyway. But just from my personal experience, a lot more kids had siblings. Could be the neighborhood I'm living in versus back then, whatever. But it just seems like there were a lot more siblings. And so that was this whole dimension to everything that was kind of cool, where, you could feel kind of like an adult responsible, for their younger siblings or your younger siblings if you had them. And then, you get practice like being an adult in those cases. And then the way you learn stuff wasn't looking it up on the internet. A lot of times the stuff that you weren't going to ask your parents about, your friend's older sibling would tell you. So it's just something cool. And number 20, bicycles. So if you wanted to get away, if you wanted freedom, if you wanted to know freedom, when you got your bicycle, if you already have one, and it's too small, your range was limited. But when you graduated up to the, big bicycle, like not necessarily adult size, but I think most of us boys back then, we had these BMX style bikes. Your range was increased quite a bit. And then most of us probably graduated up before we started driving. We would graduate up to like an adult size, like a 10-speed bike. And that allowed you to really go far. And I would ride to a completely other town from where I was. It was just tremendous amounts of exercise, I'm telling you. Lots of fun and pretty safe. We had one friend who got hit by a car in a parking lot on his bike, but he was fine. So now we're on to number 19. So when you did get a car, to socialize and to do all that fun stuff that you do on a Friday or Saturday night, especially, in a moderately sized to smaller town, like Modesto, California, for example, cruising the circuit, as it was made famous in a movie from an earlier time. It still existed in the 80s and into the 90s, I think, but most of my experience comes from the 90s, actually, with this, but it was a bigger thing as you go back in time, and it was pretty big in the 80s still. And what it is, for those of you who don't know, your town would have this natural loop develop where cars who are just cruising, they're just driving along to see and be seen, not necessarily going anywhere. It would create, like a flow, like a natural, like a flow of liquid through a circulatory system, like a main artery, basically. And then there'd be little side veins and capillaries going off to the different clicks. It just kind of organized itself, and it was really cool. And it was put down by the man in our town. And I don't know about you in your town, but if you experienced this, write it in the comments. Did the man put down your circuit? Was it snuffed by the man? Probably was. But it was a lot of fun when we did it. You'd see people, if somebody's girlfriend was kind of skipping out on him and he didn't know where she was, he would cruise the circuit and then see her with another guy. And you would watch those dramas play out. And it was just real life fun. observational fun. Number 18. So talking about conflict, who was the enemy? Well, the commie bastards, they were a distant evil, basically fictional. We didn't know at the time that our idea of communists, commie pigs, was fictional, but they were easy to hate, and nobody's feelings got hurt because in your community there weren't, ethnic commies or something like that. So it was just a good thing for that reason. Otherwise, a lot of it wasn't necessarily good. I'm not saying it was good. Number 17, the pop music, it was better, I think, just better. That's my opinion. It could be just my experience, but we didn't have auto-tune. It wasn't as much about looks. I mean, that's obvious when you go back and look at the pop stars, but their use of synthesizers is just amazing for something relatively, untapped and relatively new. They just did a grand job with it. And the one-hit wonders that came out of nowhere with MTV videos that were awful, but the music was good. So now we move on. Number 16. Already, number 16. Construction. There were new suburbs popping up everywhere, even in California, and your family could actually possibly conceivably afford to get one without having to go halvesies with another family. Number 15. Candy cigarettes. Not the biggest deal, of course, but they were just cool. They had a unique taste because they had extra powdered sugar all over them. And the powdered sugar was on the inside of the wrapper. And the wrapper was done in such a way that when you would blow out on the candy cigarette, it would make a puff of what looked like cigarette smoke, which was a cool thing. And it was actually just powdered sugar, which was not so bad to breathe, I think. Number 14. Now, this may be controversial now, but it's just a simple thing. It's just a simple thing. It's a simplicity that I miss. Men were men. Women were women. Kids were kids. Adults were adults. And parents still didn't get along, but at least kept the family together somehow, mostly, on average, a little bit more then than now. Families feuded, but they still kept the community together somehow. And, I'm not going to define what the community was like, but basically, if you read the definition of community and then still wonder what that is, then I'll just say that, yeah, we had that. And communities as a whole tended not to break down and have riots or abandon whole areas or groups of people or whatever as readily as, in the 90s and beyond. So it was nice. I mean, you knew who you were dealing with most of the time. And speaking of simplicity, for simplicity's sake, I think, or at least harmony, even though the song may not be the one you want. But number 13, everyone supported the president, basically Ronald Reagan, even though he was officially an actor. Versus nowadays, I think a lot of people don't know that presidents are actors. I don't know. Do they? I mean, Trump, if you look, he has an IMDb and he's been on tons of TV shows and everything. I mean, it starts to become a little obvious. But I don't want to get into politics. Just suffice it to say, right or wrong, and I have changed my opinion greatly from when back then. But right or wrong, people loved Ronald Reagan and supported him, and he didn't seem to get us into any big wars or anything like that. Whatever the case, it could have all been false. A lot of it probably was, I think, almost all of it. But at the time, it was just simple. It was nice. I mean, it was a good feeling, even if it wasn't justified. It would be nice to experience that again, but not be fooled by anything. Number 12, police and firemen were trustworthy, recognized members of the community who didn't wear all black, didn't come from out of town, and didn't come down on you as much, at least in the community, you know, the community police. And I included firemen in there. Just, I wouldn't have normally, but just based on recent events in California, it doesn't seem like the state firemen, the CAL FIRE seems to be on the side of the people, but for the relevance of this, you know, they were heroes in your community back then. Today, it's not a guarantee. They ought to be many times, many communities. It ought to be that way, and deservedly so still to this day in most communities, but back then there were almost no exceptions, I think. Number 11, this one, it's forgiveness or forgetfulness. Just because it was before the internet, if you did something stupid, if you did something embarrassing, if you made a bad decision, if you were in some kind of relationship you thought was a good idea then and turned out to be a horrible idea, it would be forgiven or at least forgotten because it wasn't documented online, pasted all over the internet like a lot of people must be experiencing nowadays. That must be a pretty bad thing. In the 80s, it was just something you didn't have to worry about. So we're on to the top 10 here. Number 10, regular hours. In the 80s, a lot of things were closed on Sunday, and stores weren't open 24 hours a lot of times. And although it may have been an inconvenience at times, you knew about it, and so you could prepare accordingly. And it was true in the U.S., but it was especially true in Germany or in Europe. If you lived there in the 80s, they had laws that regulated everything shut down at like 10 o'clock. And so people were, in general, mostly well-rested, happier people than today because you didn't have much to do. I mean, even if you stayed up past 10 in your home, you know, because everything's closed, you'd watch TV, but then the TV somewhere around 2 a.m. at the late, you know, on average, or sometimes midnight, depending on the channel, and there weren't many of them, it would just shut off, you know, it would just stop at some point. And you get that tone, and then they play the national anthem in the U.S., you know, and there was flash subliminal messages that you didn't even know about that made you feel good about your country, and and I'm not kidding about that. Yeah, I just found that out recently, but that's not for this video. But yeah, so there was nothing else really much to do, and so even the most insomniac night owl type people would typically fall asleep at least by around 2 a.m. on a regular basis, which is a lot more than can be said like today. Number 9, hair care, hygiene, tailored fit clothes. So one of my biggest criticisms of the 90s is the baggy, sloppy clothes that were in style. And in the 80s, it was not that way. And even like the TV bad guys would wear like a suit and tie and a belt, and their shirts were tailor fit so that the seam crossed over the shoulder at the apex of the curve, like somewhere between like the 50-degree and 80-degree angle, you know, just perfectly. And the collars and the shirts were ironed, and if they had buttons on the collar, the button would be buttoned through the collar and not left sloppy out. You know what I mean? So, yeah. So just the hair, you know, in the 70s, the criticism that I have of the 70s is, you know, it's like the 60s, but with worse hygiene. I mean, that is bad. But the 80s, it got cleaned up somehow. I mean, it was cool. I mean, even like the people into like crime and cocaine were impeccably dressed, you know, and at the lower levels, like the henchmen. And why can't our henchmen dress better, you know? Sometime in the 90s, you know, I think maybe like the East Coast Mafia just kind of got the sweats idea going, and, you know, the sloppy like jogging outfit and that type of thing. And that just, you know, if you're dealing with henchmen, it's bad enough. I mean, couldn't they just dress better, right? I mean, at least be impeccably dressed. And if you're a henchman, You know, a lot of people may not respect you. You should probably dress better. All right. So now we're on to number 8. So here's a weird thing. You go back to the 80s and fat wasn't your enemy. Sugar was like, you know, now with more sugar or sweeter, you know, the cereals, like you would put sugar on your cereal in the early 80s. I think it was pretty common to do that. But sometime in the 80s and especially in the 90s, but it started in the 80s, the cereals just came with all the sugar you could ever want for the, you know, to challenge. You want to challenge your insulin system, right? You know, just kind of keep it on its toes. Well, and candy was, you know, you go to the movie theater, you get candy. It's okay. I mean, people do it today and all that stuff, but you didn't have to feel so dang guilty about it. And guess what? Obesity was a small problem. Even what was considered obese was, I think, different. But if you just use the same clinical definition and look, there were way fewer obese people in the 80s. And it's not because of the advent of fat, sugar, and candy. I think portions were smaller if you look. And, you know, my thing about it is if you can probably eat most of what you want when you want it, but you got to watch out about what you drink. I think drinking sugar is like one of the main culprits, and then also just some other things that are affecting it that we may not have thought of that could have a big part to play on obesity. And so maybe just the lack of exercise, who knows? But it's definitely more of a problem today. So now number 7, computers were there. I mean, we had everything in the 80s almost that we have today, really. We did. We had handheld games. We had cell phones. It just wasn't like today. But it existed. Things existed in one form or another. Even the internet existed in some form. Even before the 80s, just via the library and phones. You know, it was possible to do a lot of the stuff that you do with the internet. It just took a lot longer. But that was made up for by the novelty of it and the quality of it in a lot of cases. But the nice thing about it was, and it's not true today, but back then, it was all getting better. Everything, all the technology was getting better. It wasn't going the other direction. So in the 80s, it was all there and it was all getting better. And for the most part, I think that's true in the 90s. However, the vinyl record album thing went away in the 90s. So, in my opinion, that's something that was better, but we'll get to that. That's number 5. Number 6 is first here, or next. And I kind of covered it, but it's just that the technology was all there in some form. And it was getting perfected. So, so also to tie into the next one about vinyl, we had record players. A lot of people don't know this, but we had, and I saw this work, a record player that was programmable, and it would recognize the record that you put in it, and it would do this by silently playing like the first 20 seconds of the record really fast, and it recognized the digital signature. So it knew which record it was. It knew which side of the LP was placed on there, and it could flip the LP over by itself. It was amazing to watch. And it also knew where the songs were located on each side. So it was programmed. It was just exactly like a CD player would be programmed. It just took a little longer to get to the songs, but you could program it in however you wanted it. And you could program, you could shuffle, you could have the playlists. It was all there. It's a little tedious to program, but that's made up for by the fact that you had the media physically there and it sounded better, in my opinion. So number 5, vinyl. Vinyl and cassette to a lesser extent, but mainly vinyl I'm talking about, it's analog. And I cannot stress enough about how valuable analog is, because digital, because it's binary, if you have a curve, which is what I think sound and music is, especially music, is essentially a collection and shape, the specific shape of the curvature of the pulses. It's the vibrational frequencies defined by these curves, and in its purity, in its pure form, it's a continuous curve. And the record album did the best job at replicating that. essence of music. And what digital does is it breaks it down into the binary, which means that there is no curve. You just see the curve because you're standing far enough away from it, but it's really a stair step. Okay, so it's just stair stepping. And CDs that replace the vinyl are just aluminum plates with little laser hole punches in it, and it's binary. And it just doesn't, it has a lot of information on it. Don't get me wrong. It sounds good for the most part. But if you're an audiophile and you can hear the difference, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Vinyl, where have you gone? Well, you're still there, but I mean, they had it perfected, and then it started to go backwards. That started in the 80s, so I'm kind of giving the 80s a pass here, but it's more of a 70s thing. But since I personally experienced it in the 80s, I will include it. All right, number 5 is done, and we're on to number 4, bigger TV. Speaking of better technology, the television, I had a small, like 13.5-inch diagonal, little small color television with the rabbit ear antennas, and I loved it. And I played Atari games on it and Nintendo games on it in the 90s more. It was fun. It was fun. But the TVs always got bigger. The family television got bigger, and it was always just this amazing, wonderful thing. And it continued for until recently, So a lot of you have experienced that, but that was ever present in the 80s. But imagine that feeling with the better technology multiplied across like everything, from your Walkman to, almost everything. Not necessarily stereo systems, because like I said, I think they peaked in the 80s. These vintage stereo kits that were even affordable, brand new, were prevalent, and a lot of people had them, and they sounded great. They did. Number 3, advent of home movies. Speaking of technology, just being able to get a movie and watch it at home at your convenience. And it was just so cool. And you're so used to watching movies in a theater or on television up to that point. Just being able to pause it or being able to stop it and finish it later at a time more convenient to you. It was awesome. And then also all the things about watching stuff in theaters that was good that I mentioned. If you didn't value that as much and you were affected by whatever was not good about going to the theater, like the inconvenience of it and just maybe seeing people, too many people or whatever, it was kind of cool to just watch a movie at home. And at first, I think it was really, really nice. It kind of turned south in the 90s. I think people realized, they can watch anything they want, like they're not going to be seen watching it. And then, what that led to, a bunch of garbage. But yeah, you had a decision to make, though, beta or VHS. And my family, I think, made the right decision from the get-go. I'm not sure. But I do remember going to a local library and seeing like 6 or 7 beta tapes. And then at the beginning, there were about 5 or 6 movies, and that was it. They had some Laserdisc movies, and those were pretty cool. They were really high quality. I mean, I think some people have no idea, like, they think, back then it was just 480p, like you watch a YouTube video at 480p and that's what it was like. No, I don't know how, necessarily exactly how, but before HD, there were times when the signal was so clear and, like if you watch something on Laserdisc with a new television that didn't have maybe the resolution much above 480 or whatever it is, there was something about it, the algorithms they used, or maybe some of the analog aspects of it and the materials that they used and things like that degrade over time and aren't easily replicated now. At the time, and let me tell you that the quality, it was good. It was crisp. I mean, even if you had just stereo that was built into the television, the engineers back then, they maxed out what they had available, and it was nothing to shake a stick at. But it kept getting better. That's the point with that one, too. So, and now we're on to number 2. Everyone watched the same stuff. So on TV, we didn't have that many channels. I know cable came out in the 80s, and I didn't have cable. which I considered myself to be unfortunate. But now looking back, I kind of consider myself to be fortunate because in our area, we didn't have cable. And I remember when cable came in and something changed, and that was that people just didn't know what the other was talking about if they were talking about something they saw on TV. But before the advent of cable, when you only had maybe 3 channels that came in, 3 or 4, we were kind of forced to all watch the same stuff. And even though that stuff may not have been what any of us necessarily wanted to be watching at the time, you kind of let yourself like it more than you otherwise would have, especially nowadays, just to keep yourself from boredom, which was kind of an issue back then. But the TV that we watched was the same thing that somebody else watched at the same time. And I can remember like people calling, like sometimes, the phone would ring and they know you're watching it and your friend would talk to you about it or something like that. Or people wouldn't call you at certain times because they're watching something that's riveting and good. Like when Indiana Jones Raiders of the Lost Ark was aired on TV for the first time. It's like a special movie event, go on 3.5 hours with all the commercials, but it was grand, it was cool. And, you could talk to people about it. You didn't have to explain to them, like so many times nowadays, people say, hey, did you see Gangs in New York? And I say no. And they, well, I can't, everybody saw Gangs in New York. Well, I didn't see Gangs in New York, so I can't really relate that. Sorry. And that kind of sucks. It's nice when everyone's on the same page. And it was cool because, you watch something and sometimes you would like something that wasn't actually good. And then you talk to your friends about it and they'd point out to you why, oh, that was awful. Do you know why? Oh, I didn't realize, oh yeah, that is pretty awful. Okay. And they would make fun of it and you could laugh. If you both knew something wasn't good, you'd just make fun of it. And then if something was good and you didn't see the good in it, your friends would talk to you about it. It was just nice to be able to be on the same page. And that brings us to number 1. I didn't talk as much about being outside, but we were outside a lot more. We were outside often, groups of friends playing hide and seek and stuff like that. Just about anything you can imagine. And what else was outside when we were? The sun. The sun was outside, you were outside, and the sun was shining on you. And it was your friend, not your enemy. And you were not afraid of it. And in the summers, we got suntan, sunburn sometimes, it was all right. It healed up. And I think it was good for us. And I think it made us feel better. It made us feel maybe a little closer to nature than we do today. And, the environmental movement probably wouldn't have been the same without people being outside as much, out of sight, out of mind. And what's happened to the sun nowadays, I almost never see it. It's almost never the same. It doesn't seem as yellow. It doesn't seem as bright. The skies don't seem as blue. Planes flew overhead and they didn't leave trails that just persisted and ended up covering almost the whole sky. Like every day. I mean, I see blue skies in the mornings, but as air traffic happens, the trails they leave, whatever that is, ends up covering the whole sky. So that is the list. So we've done a whole decade. So what do you think of the 80s? What did I leave off this list? Put it in the comments below and I will check it out. Thanks for listening.